All right, let's take a look at how we use the resource service. Its functionality is used for the same sort of things as the HTTP service for making AJAX calls, but it is based on RESTful architecture. So it assumes that your web server is using REST-based architecture. So let's replace all of this, for starters, with this. So now we have a resource call, and I'll come back and explain each part of that resource call in detail here in just a minute. And instead of these, we're going to inject resource. And then let's go over to our event controller. And unlike the HTTP service, you actually can bind directly to resources. So let's replace this with this. So we're just going to bind directly to what's being returned by getEvent. Back over here in our event data service, remember our getEvent method is going to return this resource object. Let's go over to the browser and I'll just show you that we're getting an error. Notice that we're getting this resource provider error. That's because resource actually is in a different module. So we need to go to our app.js, our module, and include ng resource. And then in our event details HTML, we need to include the resource module, which is this one right here, angular-resource.js. Now, if we refresh this, we're not getting any errors. We're now getting that data, but we're getting it from the resource. So let's go back and take a look at what we actually did in our event data service. So the resource service that we're using takes in a few parameters. The first one is the URL, or the format of the URL. And then the second parameter is an object that specifies default values that are used in that route. So we're saying in the route, the ID parameter is going to be replaced with the ID of the object being saved or retrieved or whatever. And then we're calling get on that resource. So we set up the resource using those parameters, and then we call get. And we're passing in an object, and we're saying we want to retrieve the object where the ID is equal to 1. And usually we would be passing in that ID to the get event, and then we would use that parameter. But this is just a simple case to show how this works. So that get works much like a promise, although it's not a promise. So over here in the event controller, it will take a while for that request to be fulfilled, and once it does, then the event will be set to the result of that. And so it kind of works like a promise, where we set event to what is immediately returned synchronously from this get, and then when the call finishes, that event object gets populated and displayed on the page. But it's not really a promise, so I can't do .then like I can with a promise. But the object that's returned from the resource call does have a promise available on it. So you call $promise .then. This isn't necessary when all you want to do is bind to the data, but it does let you handle the data when it is returned so that you could, for example, inspect the data and take some action based on the data returned before binding to it or something like that. So instead of assigning this to the scope directly, let's use this promise just like we did with our QPromise in the last clip. So on success, we will assign the returned event to the scope, and then let's just also log it out so that we can see that we can do other things in this success function. And then on failure, we'll log out the failure response. Let's take a look at this now on the page. If we open up the console and refresh, you can see that we did get our log, and notice that it was a resource. So the event that was passed back is actually a resource. That resource, you actually could use that to do gets and saves with, but I don't recommend doing that in the controller anyways. But it does work just like an event object. You can bind to it. You can say scope.event.name, and it works just as though it were an event, because you can see that it has a name property, but it does also have resource methods on it. And you can see that if an error occurs while retrieving the event, that we receive some response data, and we're going to log that out. This should just be console. So to cause an error, Let's go out to disk where the JSON files are that we're retrieving. I'm going to rename this 1.json file to 1x. That way the event that we're retrieving using our resource actually doesn't exist, and we'll get a 404. So now if we go back over to our browser and open the console and refresh, you can see that we got a 404 error. And the data that was logged out from our console.log, you can see has error data. So it has our 404 error that we received back from the server. It has a status of 404 and has headers and config data, which is the configuration of the resource object that was used to make this request. So you can see that that response data can be useful in determining and responding to different types of errors from the server. And then there's just one last thing I want to clean up here in our code. Notice that I'm passing two functions into the then function of the promise. There's actually a more semantic way to do that using the catch function. So I'm going to move this down here, and our then function will be called here, and then we're going to do a .catch and pass this function in. That's a little more semantic way to write this so that it's more obvious that you have a then and a catch there, and the second one is for handling errors. Okay, and that's all I really wanted to show you there. Next, let's take a look at how we can use the resource object to save data.